There are moments on television that seem almost impossible to explain. A performer walks onto a stage, the audience expects one thing, and then, within seconds, everything changes. In 2018, one of those moments happened on America's Got Talent when a quiet 13-year-old girl from County Durham stepped in front of Simon Cowell, Heidi Klum, Mel B, Howie Mandel, and millions of viewers. Her name was Courtney Hadwin. At first glance, there was nothing about her entrance that suggested what was coming. She appeared nervous. Her body language was reserved. She looked more like a schoolgirl who had accidentally wandered onto one of the biggest stages in American television than someone about to deliver a performance that would be remembered for years. Then the music started. Within moments, the shy teenager disappeared. What emerged was a performer with extraordinary power, an explosive stage presence, and a voice that seemed completely out of place coming from someone so young. Simon Cowell, famous for his ability to remain composed even when contestants surprise him, could only stare. It was one of the most talked about auditions of the season. But the story of Courtney Hadwin didn't end with that audition. In fact, that was only the beginning. Years later, Courtney's journey would become much more complicated than the viral clips suggested. The girl who had seemed destined for instant superstardom would discover that being discovered by millions of people is not the same thing as knowing who you are as an artist. And that is where the emotional part of this story begins. Because the internet eventually became fascinated with a dramatic claim that Simon Cowell had supposedly broken down in tears after seeing what happened to Courtney. There is no reliable evidence that Simon actually had such a breakdown, and no credible source establishes the viral claim as fact. But the reason the story continues to circulate is understandable. Courtney's journey raises a much more interesting question. What happens when the entertainment industry discovers an extraordinary child before that child has had time to discover herself? To understand that question, we have to go back to where Courtney's story really began. Long before America's Got Talent, Courtney Hadwin was simply a young girl growing up in County Durham, England. Music was already part of her world. She wasn't created by a television producer, and she didn't suddenly develop a voice because a talent show needed a memorable contestant. She had been performing for years. As a child, Courtney gradually became involved in singing and performance. She performed at school, took part in competitions, and developed her confidence through live performances. Her family supported her musical ambitions, allowing her to gain experience while she was still very young. One of the most important lessons Courtney learned during those early years was that performing could transform her. Away from the microphone, she could be shy. On stage, she became something else. That contrast would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of her public image. The quiet girl, the explosive performer, the teenager who seemed almost uncomfortable speaking, but completely fearless once the music began. Before America knew her name, Britain had already seen glimpses of that transformation. In 2017, Courtney appeared on The Voice Kids UK. She performed Tina Turner's Nutbush City Limits, and the performance demonstrated that her ability wasn't simply a one-time trick. She had stage instincts. She understood rhythm. She understood how to command attention. And most importantly, she had an unusually powerful voice for her age. She made it to the final of the competition, proving that her talent had already been recognized before America's Got Talent entered the picture. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened the following year. In 2018, Courtney walked onto the America's Got Talent stage. The judges had no idea what was coming. The audience certainly didn't. Courtney looked nervous. She introduced herself and stood in front of the judges as though she were trying to make herself as small as possible. Then the opening of Otis Redding's Hard to Handle began. Everything changed. Her voice came out with an intensity that shocked the room. It wasn't simply technically impressive. It had personality. There was grit. There was soul. There was aggression. There was an almost old-fashioned rock and soul quality that made people immediately begin comparing her to legendary performers. Simon Cowell's reaction became one of the most memorable parts of the audition. He looked genuinely surprised. That is significant because Simon had spent decades listening to singers. He had heard thousands of auditions. He had seen talented teenagers. He had seen performers with huge voices. But Courtney's transformation caught him off guard. Afterward, Cowell famously described her transformation in terms of a lion emerging from the shy girl who had walked onto the stage. Contemporary coverage of the audition recorded how stunned the judges were by the contrast between Courtney's nervous appearance and her powerful performance. And then came the moment that changed Courtney's life. Howie Mandel stood up. He pressed the golden buzzer. Gold confetti filled the stage. Courtney's face changed immediately. She began crying. Her father rushed onto the stage to embrace her. For a 13-year-old who had spent years working toward a moment like this, it was overwhelming. The golden buzzer meant that she would move directly into the live show portion of the competition. But the bigger consequence was something nobody could fully predict. The audition exploded online. Suddenly, Courtney Hadwin was no longer simply a talented teenager from England. She was an international sensation. People who had never heard of her were watching the audition. People who had never watched America's Got Talent were sharing clips. And people began asking the same question. Who is this girl? The comparisons came quickly. Janis Joplin, Tina Turner, classic rock, soul, blues. People tried to put Courtney into categories because audiences naturally want comparisons. But there was a problem. Courtney was 13. She wasn't Janis Joplin. She wasn't Tina Turner. She wasn't an older rock legend transported into the modern world. She was Courtney Hadwin. And that distinction would become increasingly important as her career developed. The television industry had discovered something incredibly marketable, a young girl who looked shy but sounded like a veteran rock singer. That contrast made for perfect television. It was instantly recognizable. It was easy to promote. It was easy to turn into a viral clip. But a career is much harder to build than a viral moment. Courtney continued through America's Got Talent and delivered several memorable performances. Her run eventually ended with a 6th-place finish in the competition. For some fans, that result was disappointing because they believed she was capable of winning the entire season. But winning wasn't the only opportunity. The exposure had already changed everything. Courtney had become known internationally. She had appeared before millions of people. She had demonstrated that her talent could survive beyond one audition. And then came another major development. At only 14, Courtney signed a recording and publishing deal involving Simon Cowell's Psycho Music and Arista Records. From the outside, this looked like the dream. A teenager discovered on America's Got Talent. A powerful record industry connection. A global audience. A future that seemed almost guaranteed. But this is where stories about young stars often become misunderstood. A record deal is not the same as a successful career. Fame is not the same as artistic fulfillment. And being told that you are special can sometimes create another problem. Everyone starts telling you what your special thing is supposed to be. For Courtney, the world had already decided what it wanted from her. The explosive 13-year-old. The young Janis Joplin. The girl with the impossible voice. The performer who could shock an audience. But what happens when the person inside that image starts growing up? What happens when a 13-year-old becomes 14? Then 15? Then 16? The audience's expectations don't necessarily grow with the person. They stay frozen around the moment that made them famous. This is one of the hardest problems faced by child performers. The public remembers the child. The artist becomes an adult. And somewhere in between, the two identities have to separate. Courtney's journey through the music industry was therefore never going to be as simple as America's Got Talent made her famous, and then she became a superstar. The reality was much more complicated. There were songs to record. There were expectations. There were creative decisions. There was the enormous pressure of knowing that millions of people were waiting for the next big thing. And Courtney was still extremely young. Imagine being 13 years old and having strangers around the world debate what kind of artist you should become. Imagine having executives thinking about your sound. Imagine producers thinking about your image. Imagine fans expecting every performance to recreate the magic of your first viral audition. That kind of expectation can become a cage. The very thing that makes a performer famous can eventually prevent that performer from changing. Courtney's story is particularly interesting because her greatest strength was also the thing people tried hardest to define. Her voice. People heard the rasp and immediately wanted another performance that sounded the same. They heard the classic rock influence and wanted more. They saw the energy and wanted the same transformation again. But artists cannot live forever inside one performance. They have to evolve. Eventually, Courtney's relationship with the music industry became more complicated. The huge mainstream breakthrough many expected did not arrive in the way fans imagined. The anticipated releases didn't turn her into an instant pop superstar. Her public profile became quieter. And whenever a young celebrity becomes quieter, the internet begins filling the silence. People started asking questions. Where was Courtney? Why wasn't she releasing more music? Had something gone wrong? Had she disappeared? Had the industry lost interest? Had she quit? The internet rarely waits for facts before creating explanations. And Courtney's story became surrounded by speculation. Some versions were dramatic. Some were sympathetic. Some were completely unsupported. But there was a simpler explanation for much of it. Growing up takes time. Finding an artistic identity takes time. And Courtney had been given an enormous amount of attention before she had reached adulthood. Instead of viewing the quieter period as the end of her career, it makes more sense to see it as a transition. The teenage sensation was becoming a young adult. And the young adult had to decide what kind of musician she wanted to be. That process is rarely dramatic from the outside. It can look like nothing is happening. But internally, it can be everything. Courtney continued working on music. She explored her sound. She continued performing. And gradually, the image created around her at 13 began to give way to something more personal. This is the part of Courtney's story that is often missing from sensational videos. The real victory wasn't becoming famous at 13. The real victory was surviving the period after fame stopped being simple. Because it is easy to go viral. It is much harder to build an identity. And Courtney eventually began showing signs of doing exactly that. Her later music moved toward a more personal rock-oriented identity, rather than simply trying to recreate the viral AGT audition. She began working with musicians and producers who could help develop that sound. One important collaborator was producer and songwriter Kevin Bowe, whose career includes work with major artists. That collaboration mattered because Courtney's music could now be approached from the perspective of an artist rather than a television contestant. The difference is enormous. A television contestant is judged in minutes. An artist is understood over years. A contestant needs a big moment. An artist needs a body of work. A contestant needs applause. An artist needs something to say. And Courtney was finally old enough to begin figuring out what she wanted to say. Then came one of the most important moments in her post-AGT story. Carnegie Hall. In April 2024, Courtney performed at the New York Pops Gala honoring Clive Davis. She performed Janis Joplin's Piece of My Heart. This wasn't another television audition. It wasn't a reality show competition. It wasn't a room full of people waiting to decide whether she deserved a golden buzzer. It was Carnegie Hall. And she was no longer 13. She was 19. That difference matters. The official event information for the Clive Davis tribute confirms the April 29, 2024 Carnegie Hall Gala, while contemporary coverage reported that Courtney opened the show with a performance of Piece of My Heart. Think about the symbolism. 6 years earlier, Courtney had been a 13-year-old girl being compared to Janis Joplin. Now she was standing on a major New York stage performing one of Joplin's songs herself. But this time, she wasn't simply being introduced as the little girl who sounds like Janis. She had grown. She had lived through the strange experience of becoming famous before she was old enough to fully understand fame. And she was standing on the stage as Courtney Hadwin. That is a much more powerful story than the viral claim that Simon Cowell cried. Because the real emotional question isn't whether Simon shed tears. It's whether the industry learned anything from Courtney's experience. And whether Courtney learned something about herself. The answer appears to be yes. Her later work suggests that she became increasingly interested in authenticity rather than simply reproducing the image people first fell in love with. That evolution is important. At 13, Courtney had no reason to know exactly who she wanted to become. At 19 or 20, she had more experience. She had already seen the excitement of fame. She had seen the disappointment. She had seen how quickly the public can move from "you're amazing" to "where have you been?" She had experienced the difference between being famous and having a sustainable career. Those lessons cannot be taught in a classroom. You have to live them. And perhaps that is why her later performances feel different. There is still that incredible voice. The rasp is still there. The power is still there. The stage presence is still there. But there is something else. Ownership. The performer is no longer simply trying to prove that she deserves to be on stage. She knows she belongs there. That distinction can take years to develop. Meanwhile, the internet continued to revisit her America's Got Talent audition. Millions of people still discovered Courtney through that clip. Every new generation of viewers experienced the same shock. A shy teenager walks out. The music begins. She explodes. Simon stares. Howie hits the golden buzzer. Confetti falls. The audience screams. It is almost a perfect television moment. But perfect television moments can create imperfect expectations. Viewers see 3 minutes. The performer lives the years afterward. That is why stories about young stars need to be told carefully. It is tempting to create a dramatic narrative where a powerful television executive discovers a child, the child suffers because of fame, and the executive eventually regrets everything. It makes a compelling story. But reality is usually more complicated. There is no verified evidence that Simon Cowell sat down years later and broke down in tears because he believed he had ruined Courtney Hadwin's life. There is no reliable evidence establishing the dramatic quotations that circulate online